Well, thank you ever so much for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm Tim Sexton. For those of you that don't know me, I work for Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust at Rutland Water Nature Reserve. I've spent much of my working career on post-industrialised sites and tend to spend most of my time away from work looking at the more undesirable parts of Nottinghamshire. So I like spending a lot of time on brownfield sites, which are obviously rich areas for finding invertebrates and all sorts of other bizarre things, as anyone that's spent any time on a brownfield site in the middle of Nottingham will find out. The talk I'm going to give this morning is focusing on the invertebrate recolonisation of Rufford Colliery, which is a site just outside of Mansfield that Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust has been working very closely with past and present owners to turn into a wildlife haven and link some fantastic habitats in the heart of the Sherwood Forest landscape. One thing I will add, and it was interesting that Alex mentioned it earlier, was the STDs in ladybirds. So one of my other claims to fame is, according to the Derby Telegraph, I am a leading expert in STDs in ladybirds, having spent no time ever looking at it. So I think I was the unfortunate person in the office that answered the telephone when that story broke and just happened to know a bit about ladybirds, and the link was made. So just really a brief introduction. Rufford Colliery sits just a few miles outside of Mansfield in what was originally the heart of the Sherwood Forest landscape as it was back in the 1600s, and now sits sort of just on the southern edge of the forest as we know it today. The colliery was opened in 1911 and operated up until 1993, when it eventually closed. And at its peak, it was removing about 1 million tonnes of coal out of the ground, so a really big industrial site. About 2,000 people worked there during its heyday. Rufford Colliery eventually closed in 1993, and the process to demolish the infrastructure began in 1994, leaving only scars of the landscape as it formerly was, the entrance road there to the colliery and the main site, in place today, and the rails leading up to the coal stocking areas there. And in the distance, the only real reminder of its sort of historic industrial past is, if you see just to the top of the picture there, the headstocks from Clipston Colliery. Traditional restoration schemes back in the day for coal mines involved covering the ground with a predominantly ryegrass mix and planting exotic trees, particularly things like Corsican pine, for instance, exotic conifers. But it was in 1996 when a planning application was made to Nottinghamshire County Council to extend the volume and time period for the coal tipping and blending at the site from the nearby Clipston Colliery, that it provided an opportunity to re-evaluate the planning application and for the proposals for the site that were originally drawn up in the 1980s. And Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust, particularly people like Janice Bradley, worked very closely with RJB Mining, which later became UK Coal and now Harworth Estates, the company that owned the site, to basically create a more significant ecologically enhanced restoration scheme. The plan was to establish habitats that were more appropriate to the Sherwood Forest landscape, to the national area, lowland heath and oak birch woodland, and then to create 90 hectares of heathland and 30 hectares of woodland that would link together and provide a stepping stone between some of the existing sites like Reneth Heath, Clipsham Heath and Strawberry Hills Heath. And then triple SIs like the Sherwood Forest Golf Course as well, which just sits on the north-western boundary of the site. It would create about 40% of the Heathland Biodiversity Action Plan habitat target for that habitat in Nottinghamshire, so a really good project. And more recently, changes in the mining scheme resulted in an application for the extraction of coal slurry and finings to come from the unrestored slurry lagoons. And Harworth Estates agreed to complete the extant restoration scheme and further enhance some of those areas of the heathland and bring them into good conservation management. When fully restored, the Rufford Colliery is going to comprise of 296 hectares of acid grassland, heathland and oak birch woodland in this rich mosaic, and you can see just the dotted line there where the current area of the site is in relation to some of the other triple SI heathlands within that part of the Sherwood Forest. Now, you truly understand the value of projects like this when you consider that around 85% of heathland has been lost in the UK in recent years, and most of those losses have come in the last sort of 50 or so years through things like agricultural enhancement and development, conifer planting and succession, and poor management. And the losses, of course, are most obvious within lowland heathland, where the value of heathland to the local economy is far less than that in the uplands. Now, the difficulty of establishing vegetation on coal spoil is that it's a rather harsh substrate. It starts off as very alkaline and then becomes more acidic with time. So as plants start to establish and the alkalinity of the soil changes over a period, they often die off and don't succeed. The coal spoil is also high in salts as well. It bakes hard in the summer and becomes a slushy mush in the winter as well. So it had all sorts of challenges. But at Rufford Colliery, the process was accelerated by importing local Sherwood sandstone, covering the sort of grey slurry, you can see in the top left-hand side picture there, to create a more suitable bed for establishing heather. They used a nurse crop, including things like bent grass, sheep's fescue, and wavy hairgrass to enable the heather, brash, and the seeds to then start to establish and take. So this is one of the more recently established areas of acid grassland. You can see some of the heather starting to establish there, and this is one of the earlier restored areas, which are absolute haven for invertebrates. Over the last 20 years or so, lots of heathers become established, and it's a real wash with colour, some really good opportunities for pollinators. 4 different species of heather, including bell heather, common heather, hoary heath, and then cross-leaved heath as well in the more wetter areas of the site. And of course, they've got large stands of gorse, which again provide a massive abundance of nectar and pollen for invertebrates. So in recent years, there's been lots of studies on birds. Alex alluded to the fact that aves are the most commonly recorded species. So unsurprisingly, there's been lots of bird surveys. In fact, it's become one of probably the best, if not one of the best, sites for breeding woodlark in the county. You've now got breeding nightjar. In the period I was surveying through the summer, little ringed plover attempted nesting on a number of occasions on some of the wetter areas of the heath. There's been bat surveys, so Leisler's bats are commonly recorded there. Interestingly, there's been lots of bryophyte surveys, so about 70 different species of mosses and liverwort, including some really rare species, have been recorded there, and including things like common lizard as well, which can be found across much of the site. So I became involved in the project during the COVID lockdown, which seems like a very long time ago now, but I'm sure it's very fresh in many people's minds. As a volunteer, when I was furloughed from my job at Attenborough Nature Reserve at the time, and the part of the project that I was working with supported the aims of the Minor to Major project, which is a big Heritage Lottery funded project that celebrates the diverse wildlife and habitats and rich heritage of the Sherwood Forest. There were some target invertebrate species for this project. They had 3 species, which were the 3 green shiny species, which was a citizen science project. So that was recording things like forester moth, green tiger beetle, and then the green hair streak butterfly as well. But then there were also species such as the European bee wolf and also Adonis ladybird as well that were included in there. So green tiger beetle, quite common on the site, as well as at the adjacent Wreneth Heath as well. It was one of the first species of invertebrate to be recorded in some of the newly sort of restored areas of the heathland. However, despite sort of the odd record coming in like this, there'd never been any systematic surveying for invertebrates on the site over its history. And when you consider that in the UK some 5,000 species of invertebrate are associated with heathland, you can understand my excitement and interest in getting involved in this area. So it's around 50% of British spiders and true bug species can be found in heathland, and it supports many species that are on perhaps the most northern edge of their European range as well, and some quite rare and interesting species. So I was tasked with doing a walkthrough survey over a period of many months during the summer period, and it's actually continued to this day, so I'm still working on this project on the rare occasions I get off work, and just really to set a baseline for invertebrates for the site. So we split the site into 10 discrete recording zones based on main broad habitat type, but also restoration period as well, so that we've got some way of dividing up the site. As I say, it's about 293 hectares, so quite a large area in total. There's no official public access to this site, so everything I'm going to show you today, unfortunately, you're just going to have to enjoy from the photographs. There's a couple of footpaths that do sort of cross the site, but largely the former colliery is out of bounds to members of the public. Now, when I started the surveys in late June, I very quickly realised that the site was important for Hymenoptera, bees and wasps. It's where I made most of the important discoveries, particularly the rarer species that we don't tend to find that far into the Midlands. Over 70 species in total over 2 summers I recorded just in bees and wasps, and many of which have previously never been recorded in Nottinghamshire before, or nationally notable and scarce in the Midlands. A lot of the bees that you find on sandy heaths tend to be restricted to the southern parts of Britain, but obviously as we see a changing climate, we might start to see a lot of those species moving further north as time goes by. This is Andrena flavipes, which is the yellow-legged mining bee, extremely common on the site. They have 2 flight periods in the year, so you get them early between March and May, and then again between June and August. And there's a big bank in an area of the site called the Desert, which was a former sand quarry, whereby some of the sandy banks, which you could probably make out there, I've got a slightly better picture there. You've got this lovely south-facing bank that provides, an absolute wonderful habitat for mining bees. So along with Andrena flavipes, the yellow-legged mining bee, we also had Nomada furcata as well, which is a nationally notable species, nationally notable A, and the first record of its kind to be found in Nottinghamshire. They're a parasite or kleptoparasite of Andrena flavipes. So there were many of them hovering around the bee banks. They hover around the entrances of the Andrena holes and enter the nest where they lay their eggs. And they've got wonderful olfactory senses, the females. So they can determine whether a nest has been provisioned with food. They can also see whether it's been parasitized by another one of its kind, if a bee is actually in the nest at the time, and indeed whether there's any other parasitic bees around. So they're quite clever things. Another parasite that we got regularly there was Recolonisation puncticeps, which parasitizes the Lasioglossum bees. And then Philanthus triangulum, the European bee wolf, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a target for the minor to major project. And along that bee bank, we found about 300 nesting holes for this species. So again, it had barely been recorded in Nottinghamshire when I started the project, but we found 2 or 3 discrete sites across the colliery where they were actually nesting in good number. Obviously, they're called bee wolf because they provision their nests with things like honeybees and some of the other solitary bees as well. So it's a priority species for Nottinghamshire. There used to be a red data book species, RDB2, but there's good evidence to suggest that they're increasing in number massively in Britain, again, probably due to a warming climate. There were a number of dipteran parasites around, you'll be pleased to know, all you dipterists in the room. This is Miltogramma punctata, which again parasitizes the solitary bees. It's commonly called the spotted bee burglar, which gives you a bit of an indication as to what it does. It's one of the Sarcophagidae, the flesh flies. Bombylius major as well, the bee fly, was quite commonly found around many of the solitary bee nests. And then in late summer, you get things like Andrena fuscipes, the heather mining bee. They peak in August to coincide with the abundance of flowers coming from the heather. And some great plasterer bees. So there's 5 species of Colites recorded in Nottinghamshire. I had 4 of those on site, including Colites folians, which is a nationally notable species and the first record of its kind for BC 56. They're really interesting. They've got bilobed tongues, which they use to line the nest with this cellophane-like substance which protects it from fungi growing in the nest. Are quite clever things as well. I expect that Colites hederae, which is another recent arrival in the county, the ivy bee, is very likely to be on site. I've just not recorded it yet. So I'll have all 5 species, hopefully, recorded in Nottinghamshire on this one site. So it gives you an indication of how important it is. Now, the Colites are actually parasitised by the variegated cuckoo bees, the Epiolus. There's only 2 species recorded in the UK, both of which I came across at Rufford. This is Truciger, the red-thighed Epiolus, but we also had variegatus, the black-thighed as well. And this is how they sleep, like many solitary bees. They grasp on with their mandibles to a blade of grass or a bit of vegetation, and just hang out overnight, which is quite cool. The biggest surprise, actually, was to find the large sharp-tailed bee, Coelioxys coenoides. And this is a species that's largely restricted in Britain to parts of the east coast and the south coast. It's probably the first, or one of very few records for the East Midlands, and certainly the first record for Nottinghamshire. And they're kleptoparasites of the leafcutter bees, and in particular Megachile maritima, which again, as the name suggests, is often found on the coast. Now, whilst I didn't find the host, we did find a big aggregation of Willoughbyella, the willoughby's leafcutter bees. These are all males hanging out in what I could only describe as being a bit of a bachelor pad at the start of the spring in an old fence post. So I counted about 20 male bees in that fence post crack. It wasn't just bees, there were lots of wasps. So Ammophilus abulosa, the banded sand wasp, is quite common across the site. They predate caterpillars and drag them. They can't often fly with some of these bigger sized caterpillars, so they just drag them with their long gangly legs across the sand and take them to their burrows where they bury them, and often steal other Ammophila nests as well. I'm a big fan of weevils, so I should have mentioned that at the start. So I wasn't too pleased to see this. This is Cerceris arenaria, which is the weevil hunting wasp. It's locally common in Britain, certainly within the Midlands. And they paralyse weevils, take them back to the nest and provision the nest with them. This one's got a vine weevil, which will please any gardeners out there. And I challenged my colleague, Elliot, who was doing this project with in the first couple of years, to go out and find me a vine weevil. And I was sat by this bank that had probably about 50 or so females coming in and provisioning their nests with weevils. And I counted a couple of hundred weevils being brought back to the nest by the wasps. And my colleague couldn't find a single one. So again, they must have incredibly attuned olfactory senses to be able to locate them. But basically, a colony of around 1,000 wasps can collect about 100,000 weevils in a single season. So, you know, nature's pest controllers, they do a great job at keeping the weevil numbers down. We also found Cerceris riboensis as well, which feeds on solitary bees, and again does a similar thing, provisioning its nest with the bees to feed its larvae. Like the bees, there's many kleptoparasites as well of the wasps. The kleptoparasite of Cerceris arenaria is a species called Hedochrome nimile, and I thought when I saw this that was what it was. However, because I was quite new to the chrysid wasp, the ruby-tailed wasp, they're quite a difficult taxa to identify. I took a couple of specimens home with me to have a closer look at, and I realised it was in fact a completely different species, which has just sort of started to move northwards in recent years in Britain, which is Hedochrome nobile. And it turned out that after taking some other specimens back to just confirm the record, that that's indeed what it was. Again, first record for Nottinghamshire. I sent them off to be confirmed as well to a local expert. And, you know, they came back and agreed with my identification. We also have things like Chrysis viridula as well, which is a lovely little wasp. A suggestion that this species is actually declining in the UK quite considerably. And things like Hedocridium ardens as well, which was the first record for Nottinghamshire, which is a very tiny ruby-tailed wasp. And this was new for Nottinghamshire when I first found it in 2020. And Trevor Pendleton's been out to a couple of other sites, including Budby, and found it there too. So I had Cuprium as well, which is another similar species to that. Now, changing the subject slightly, but there is a bit of a link here. Rufford Colliery is actually plagued by illegal off-roading, and it's caused a massive problem for the likes of Janice, who's trying to restore the site, along with Harworth. Every time they go out and seed up an area, over the winter, these off-roaders will come out, have a bit of fun, taz around in their off-road vehicles, whether I think that was a Land Rover at one stage, and create a right mess of the habitat. You can see the donuts that have been done over this recently established area of acid grassland. This old coal spoil heap, you know, is a classic to drive down with your 4x4. So very frustrating. However, I did see light at the end of the tunnel, or a silver lining to the cloud, in what I've termed mechanical megafauna. Now, I'm not suggesting we go and do illegal off-roading on our nature reserves, but, you know, we talk about rewilding and using large herbivores to sort of create habitat structure. Now, this is an area of monoculture sort of standards, all the same age and size structure of gorse across this bank. And at the bottom of the bank is this lovely little pond, which you can see there. And of course, if you're an owner of a 4x4 doing illegal off-roading, what could be more exciting than sliding down this bank here into this water feature at the bottom? So lots of people doing it. But what I noticed is when the banks got too steep, they gave up on that area because it was too dangerous even for the stupid people. So they then move on to another area and start creating a new line to the water hole, you might call it. You know, if that was aurochs back in the day or something like that, trying to get to this watering hole, they would just go wherever they found was the easiest route down. Now, this bank here, because it's not being used anymore, started becoming a really good habitat for solitary bees. And also, you get this different age structure of vegetation established. So you can see there a slightly different structure, and that went along the length of the bank. So you can see how my idea of mechanical megafauna is coming together. This was a particularly bad area, but all along this side was absolutely full of European bee wolf and about 6 other species of solitary bee, and what was formerly, you know, a 4x4 track that was later abandoned. And in fact, some of the areas that, you know, on a dry sandy heath, as it is in many places, the constant compaction by 4x4s started to create ephemeral pools, which of course then attracted things like damselflies and dragonflies as well. So, like I say, I wouldn't recommend it, but it's quite interesting. And in fact, the current actions of management actually include replicating large herbivores, pushing over trees, creating root plates, and creating sandy areas that are exposed for things like basking lizards, and other invertebrate species as well. Wasn't just bees, so dingy skipper had just started to become established on site, found in the early spring, particularly in the areas of birdsfoot trefoil and the entrance to the reserve, or the complex. We also had small heath as well, in good number, small copper as well. This is the blue-winged aberration you can see there. And a lot of really interesting day-flying moths as well. So I like to do a lot of photography, as you've probably worked out, but beautiful yellow underwings, a very difficult moth to photograph, very beautiful moth, but I stick to photographing the caterpillars because I find that when you get to the adult moth, it's nectaring for 1 minute, you get close enough with your camera and it flies off about 100 metres along the heathland. So I sort of gave up on getting a decent picture, and that's the best you're going to get, unfortunately. There's a lot of broom on site as well as the gorse. We found the streak first as a caterpillar and went back later in September to find the moth. Again, it's an uncommon species in BC 56. Section 41 and a BAP priority species as well. And really good abundance of them on site. Like I say, they don't fly until much later in the season, so a lot of moth trappers tend to have packed their moth traps away by then and missed them. Along with that, we have things like grass wave as well, which is another locally common species. The caterpillars feed on heathers, but also sometimes gorse and broom as well. We did do some clearwing luring. The only one we actually got was six-belted clearing. That's not to say that other species aren't there, but probably we're just looking at the wrong times, or the weather conditions weren't right when we went out for them. But the larvae of the six-belted clearwing feeds on vertebrate trefoil, and as you can see at the entrance to the colliery complex, there's this wonderful just wash of colour where the verges are absolutely covered in vertebrate trefoil, along with some other wonderful plants like sheep sorrel as well. Managed to do a couple of moth trap sessions during the summers, and obviously there's nothing super special. I think the redneck footman was probably the most exciting thing, and perhaps garden tiger there at the bottom right, which is a species that in Nottinghamshire seems to be declining and certainly restricted to the Sherwood Forest and area and north. True lover's knot, probably the most common noctuid there on the top left-hand side within the heathland. But some really nice micros as well. And again, whilst not really super rare, I think probably the most interesting one was the rosy knothorn there, which was the first record for the county at the time. Graphilita internana there, the feeds on gorse. And then Eucosma campoliliana, which is a species that feeds on ragwort. Now, it's not rare at the moment, but obviously as we see this sort of widespread vilification of ragwort across the country, it's a species that perhaps might become scarce in future years. And as a beetle fan, now I've not really done much in terms of beetle surveying at Rufford to date, plan to do a lot of that this summer. We've got some really good bycatch in the moth trap, so things like the common cockchafer, the June chafer, brown chafer and the door beetle there at the bottom were nice to see in amongst the moths, but couldn't help but trip over this blue rove beetle, which is again a very scarce species, Achaicus ophthalmicus, in Britain, nationally notable A. It's only the second record in Nottinghamshire since 1912. I've gone on to see it a number of times on the site, but just to give you an indication of its distribution across Britain, that's the MBN gateway map for that species, and you can see just Nottinghamshire there, just a couple of dots. This is probably Steve Lane, I would imagine, who's a coleopterist from Norfolk and spends a lot of time recording there. Again, some very sort of common species you might expect to find on the heathland, heather ladybird, which is found locally in Britain but appears to be declining. Strophosoma sus there, the weevil that feeds on heather. Adonis ladybird we caught up with a number of times. And then Lochmea suturalis there at the top, which in places can actually be detrimental to the heathland because, you know, when the numbers really build up, they can cause a lot of damage feeding on the leaves. Most of my best finds, I would say, were always when I was sat down eating my lunch. I think it's because it's the only time you sit and stop still and really take in what's around you. Otherwise, you're sort of walking around chasing after things with your sweep net. This is Gronops lunatus, which is, again, quite a scarce weevil. Like I said earlier, big fan of the weevils. It has a range predominantly around the south and the east parts of Britain where it feeds on spurries. And there's only one other record in Nottinghamshire, which is over in Spalford Warren, right on the border with Lincolnshire. So, yeah, quite a nice find. As always, sandwich in one hand, weevil in the other hand is how I like to roll, really, to be honest. Another group I didn't really have time to explore in any detail was spiders, although when you're beating gorse and stuff like that for other invertebrates, inevitably you'll find something exciting. And this large orb weaver I found I was a bit unsure of at first. It looked familiar, but I wasn't sure of its identification when I was out in the field. I took it back with me, and it turns out to be Agalanatia reddii, which is the gorse orb weaver. And again, quite a scarce species in the Midlands. It was the first record, again, for Nottinghamshire. And again, probably a lot more work needs to be done on the site on spiders. I'm sure there'll be even more exciting things to find. Arctosa perita, the sand bear spider, again, was probably the most common species in terms of spiders I came across. And what was quite interesting to see is the individuals you find on the sort of remnant coal spoil areas were always the dark morphs, and the species or individuals that you find in the sandy areas tend to be the lighter morphs. So quite interesting to see. They're excellent parents, these, like all wolf spiders, really, to be honest. And having 2 children myself, I feel the pain of having to give piggybacks to about 30 kids, as that one is doing there. But obviously they carry their spiderlings around until they're ready to defend themselves and feed for themselves. What I thought was actually a spider was when I was first on site with Janice doing a walk around. We noticed these wonderful sort of silky webs over the gorse. We've had a really dry spring and early summer, not much wind and barely any rain. And so these fine webs literally covered, it was like this alien landscape covering all of the gorse. And again, not really too sure what it was that was causing them. At first I thought maybe some sort of money spider or something like that. And then looked a bit closer and realised they're actually gorse spider mites, which again, it's quite a rare find in the UK, probably because, you know, unless you get those weather conditions perfectly right, you don't notice them because you won't see those webs. They're just about 0.5 millimetre across, and according to the NBN database, there's only 10 other records in Britain for that species. I'm sure they're common wherever they're found on gorse. And in fact, where gorse is introduced non-native species, particularly in places like North America, this mite is actually used as a biocontrol mechanism for reducing gorse. Now, I did mention I'd put some other flies in here. The Micropeza found both of the species that are found in Britain. This is probably the more common of the 2 species, Corrigeolata, but also found Lateralis as well, which is a nationally notable species and tends to be restricted to areas that are rich in gorse and broom as well. And we'll just finish off with just a couple of other nice finds. A mottled grasshopper, which you don't often see in many places across Nottinghamshire. It's our smallest native species of grasshopper, and very common in those dry, sandy, sort of bare areas of ground. And like the spiders, in the areas where the coal spoil is, tend to find more of the darker morphs and the lighter morphs. It's about 12 described colour morphs of the mottled grasshopper. And whilst we're on colours, I thought I'll talk about the erythricism of grasshoppers, particularly the common field grasshopper. You might be led to believe that it's a really rare find. I don't know if any of you lot have ever come across them, but if we go back to our favourite Daily Mail articles and the Express and the Metro, I think, you would believe they were like hen's teeth. However, I found at least 10 different individuals on one particular day. They don't often reach their sort of adult form because they're so brightly coloured that they're often picked off by birds quite easily, unlike the green grasshoppers or the brown grasshoppers that sort of blend in with their natural environment. However, we did actually find a couple of adults, which was quite surprising. It's the first. I've seen a number of pink grasshoppers in my lifetime, but it's the first time I've ever seen a fully winged adult. And I thought to myself, I wonder whether that provides them with the perfect camouflage for living within a heathland landscape, particularly when the flowers come out. And I'll leave you just finally with one other sort of area of interest, which is fungi. Completely out of the invertebrate sort of point of the day, really, to be honest, but just to show you, you never quite know what you're going to find on these sites. This is a tiny relative of the earth tongues, Sarcoleoscia globosa, and I spotted it 2 years ago in autumn. I didn't really think much of it, took a few specimens away, had a look at the spores, which, as like most of the Ascomycetes, are quite noticeable, quite obvious. They were like sort of boomerangs, these ones. And I looked at some reference material, managed to identify it, sent it to Howard Williams, who confirmed the identification. And he said, you better send it to Kew Gardens, at which point I'd run out of specimens. So I was like, I've got nothing really to send them. However, I can go back and have a look. And I went back and I went back and I went back, and I could never find that patch of fungi again until this year, or autumn just gone, where I searched some different areas of the heathland and found a massive patch in a completely different area, sent it off to Kew Gardens, and they confirmed it as being the first record of that species for England and the first confirmed record for Britain. So it just goes to show you never know what you're going to find. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you for listening.